Hi, I'm Kirk Kernut.
And I'm Ashley Gordon.
And welcome to episode 7 of Reading for the Rest of Us.
And this one we're calling Cityscapes.
Cityscapes.
It's all about cities, books and cities.
How did we come up with this idea for the show?
Well, we came up with it because I have been reading a new book called Londoners by Craig Taylor. And it is a compilation of interviews that he compiled over a few years of living in London of absolutely everybody. Of course, cab drivers, the head of the lost and found department for the Tube, the London's Underground, immigrants, Cockneys, people who work in every facet of London life. And it's absolutely fascinating. And that got me thinking about the city of London and other books about London. And then it was, hey, how about you pick cities you like and I pick cities I like and books that are about them, and we'll focus in.
We did an episode a few ago about setting, where we talked about the role of place in books. And in some ways this is a more specific version of that, I think. And I love the fact that you named it Cityscapes, because really when we talk about cities as characters in books, the architecture, the whole, the vista, the whole presence, really right down to the detail, not just the people, but the shape of the streets and the flow of everything.
It informs everything about the story. Certainly nonfiction, of course, which this book is and a few others that I read, but in all of the fiction, they couldn't be set anywhere else. They would have to be in this city.
And the other fun part about doing Cityscapes is you talk about real-life places, and they're not always, sort of the obvious tourist stops, but you are set in the real-life bars or the real-life restaurants or the real-life sports
or
venues.
Almost. I remember the first time I went to London, I tried to find Sherlock Holmes' address.
That's
it's
right.
not actually there.
That does
but
not
a lot
exist.
of these places are, there are intersections of streets that really do exist, and you can walk in the footsteps of the characters.
Okay.
It's fun.
Well, the way we divided this up is Ashley took 3 international cities, and I took 3 domestic cities, 3 American cities. So I guess my first question is, Ashley, why do you hate America?
I don't hate America.
No.
But I do love to escape every now and then.
Okay. So your first city is London.
London.
Tell us a little bit about your relationship with London and your relationship with London books.
Yeah, I could do days on London. I ran off to London when I was 19 and have been in love with the city ever since, and get back whenever I can. And it is truly a bibliophile's city.
Right.
And this is definitely reading for the rest of us. And so the books that we've picked, as usual, and as the phrase I've used before, run the gamut. We're trying to find a book for everybody. So somewhere in this episode should be a book that you'll love. But London is truly the city of books and bookstores and people who love to read and writers.
Do you remember the first London book that you read?
Oh, I don't know that I could.
Okay, what's the most important one? What's, like, if we were going to pick the most historically important, what's the biggie?
I wonder if Tale of Two Cities might not be that.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, and I remember hating Dickens growing up because, and we may have touched on this before too, who in God's name thought David Copperfield was a good book for an 8th grader? Dreadful.
Yeah.
But then I read Tale of Two Cities as an adult and came to understand why Dickens is so popular. And when you look at the role of those cities in that book and their history, because they do have personalities. London very definitely has a personality that's quite different from Paris or Venice, which is the other city I chose, which I've never been to, unfortunately, but would like to. I have been in stories. So Tale of Two Cities, I think, is an example of how using a specific place can then motivate the characters, push the story along. That book couldn't be anywhere other than those 2 cities at that time in history.
Okay. Well, you mentioned The Londoners, which is sort of sounds like almost a sociological overview of the city in some ways, sort of a tour.
It's exactly that.
Tour of the people of the city, which is great. What's a good London novel? Do you have one in your magic stash there?
I do. See, that's just piles
of books.
London. It sort of depends on which place you want to be. So this is one I got recently. This is the pick up the book because of the cover.
Okay.
This is the Queen takes a train, and it's the imagined day for Queen Elizabeth if she did a runner. She went walkabout, trying to come up with all the British phrases I can for that.
That's great. I love that.
Yeah,
Turn it just a bit so we can get it on there.
See, there's Londoners, and here we go. She borrows a rain jacket and goes out after the corgis, and then just kind of keeps going.
So is the Queen a likable character in this book?
She's a quite likable character.
Well, that's good. That's good to know.
But she's not terribly warm. I mean, it's
yeah. Well,
it
she's
seems
British.
real enough to
Yeah.
actually be the Queen if she wandered off and wanted to be a normal person for a day.
Okay.
If you're not an Anglophile or a royalist, shall we say, Nick Hornby is a great writer. He's very, very funny, and he's very definitely of the city, and its youth and its culture, and it's not exactly snarky, but certainly not buying into everything traditional.
Yeah.
And
they are fun books, and I have not read that particular one. That's the one.
This one's all about suicide.
Suicide, I was going to say. Title, of course, is a long way. Is it a long way down?
A long way down.
Long way
but
down.
It's very funny.
And it's the jumping off buildings. But the one, of course, the one that Nick Hornby is most famous for is the first one that he did about the record store.
Yes.
High Fidelity.
High Fidelity, that John Cusack made into a really good movie.
They made it into a movie, and of course Americanized it by moving it to Chicago. But it's a wonderful book to read, and they are full of places. That's what I like, and a lot of his stuff is kind of off the beaten path.
It is, and you get the feel for the different neighborhoods in London, and London is very definitely a city of neighborhoods. In fact, one of the things we talked about when we were discussing doing cities is particularly picking those where we could find guides.
Right.
And so if you were going to London, and even if you aren't, a bit of armchair traveling, Chronicle Books is a publisher that does lots of fun, unusual book-type products. And they have a collection of cards that are city walks. Okay. And so each neighborhood, London is one of the greenest cities in the world. It has more green space than almost any other major city. And much of it is private, but a significant amount, enough to keep you busy for a couple of days, is public. And so there are not only historical buildings, but the parks and lots of museums. And they have this wonderful little, they're blue circles, blue porcelain circles that are on buildings, and you'll walk by and, oh, D.H. Lawrence lived here.
Yeah, yeah.
And so you sort of discover them. And there actually is you can get a book that tells you all of the places to go to those.
Great.
But so City Walks is one of the ways to discover London, and it does it by neighborhoods. Like this one is Waterloo to Whitehall. And any books that you read, like of course, the P.D. James and Agatha Christie, and there's so many British mysteries
that are set there.
That are set in London. John le Carré's spy novels. I mean, there are just tons of books that a lot of people have read, and you'll recognize the neighborhoods, and it's fun to see exactly how you would get sort of from A to B.
Yeah.
And then the quintessential London guide is called the. Grab this one. It's the A to Z. They say Z instead of Z. And this is every street in the city. And you could look up absolutely any place that you are reading about and find it. And even people that live there have this, because you never learn everything about London unless maybe you are a cabbie.
All right, well, let's jump across the pond here real quick and do first city I chose is Atlanta. Oddly enough, not necessarily a city we think of as literary, I would say, but I had an experience where the last fall I sort of discovered this guy, Ralph Dennis, who died in the 80s, but in the 70s he began putting out these paperback books that are kind of fun. I sort of got into collecting. I've only found 2 out of the 12 that are around, but this is a series about a former Atlanta cop named Jim Hardman and his buddy Hulk, or Hump, excuse me, Hump, former football player, and they buzz around Atlanta solving crimes. They're fun, hard-boiled kind of books.
There ain't any buzzing around Atlanta unless this is before all the cars.
This is pure 1970s Atlanta.
Okay.
So just to give you a flavor of the what these are like, if we can go close screen on this. I love the cover illustrations because they are so 1970s. And the great thing about these books, you have to dig around online to find them.
Would this be pulp fiction?
This is pulp fiction. These are books that were written for men. This is before.
No.
This is hard to believe, I know, but before men had Showtime or HBO to watch. This was their adventure. And the great thing about these books is they still smell like wonderful
They smell like
paperbacks.
books?
Yeah, I mean,
Okay, smell.
catch me. But
Could you like turn them into little dangly, hanging from the rearview mirror air fresheners?
there's no dangly things with men's books. I mean, this you walk around and this you make a fist and hold these up.
I've totally thrown you off.
But the great thing is, they're fabulous pictures of Atlanta in the 70s, and so.
What was Atlanta like in the 70s?
Well,
what does that mean?
It was really coming out of that civil rights era. So there's a lot of great sort of things about the neighborhoods, the changing, the white flight is going on. But it's also the building of the suburbs out there, and so you have the rich areas and the sort of middle sort of urban blight. And what's very cool is, like, in one of these books, the Omni has just opened up. So they go down to the Omni for a fight, and they're talking about, if you've ever seen 70s architecture, it's not the most attractive. I mean, it's very spacey and it looks
institutional.
Yeah. And these books talk about how terrible the architecture is of a lot of these buildings.
They were written at the time the buildings were going up, and people hated them even then.
Even then.
So did Atlanta have a character at that point? Because I've lived in Atlanta and love it, but compared to some of the other cities we're talking about, it doesn't immediately have a character.
It didn't have that. According to these books, it didn't have that sort of metropolitan flavor that we think of it having now, where it has had so many, waves of people moving into it that it's lost its southernness.
Right, finding an Alabama native is a challenge.
Right.
Atlanta native.
But it is very much, it is Atlanta as a hard-boiled city. And that's what I like. And in fact, if you go to even contemporary guides, I mean, this guy's very obscure, Ralph Dennis, and these books are hard to find. I mean, I've searched around. The first two I could find took me about 4 months to find. So it's not like these are readily available on the shelf, but you still go to Atlanta tourism guides, and there's a restaurant that these characters hang out in called George's. And every tourist guide I've looked at for Atlanta mentions George's Restaurant, and it says, oh, by the way, this was made famous in the 70s because they appeared in Ralph Dennis's Hardman series. So you can tell it's a point of pride for these some of these places to have been mentioned in these books. So.
And what kind of restaurant is it?
Well, I mean, I'm sure it has changed. I mean, back in the 70s, it's kind of a dude's hangout, kind of not quite a bar, but a nice hangout where a man can go have
the precursor to a sports bar.
Well, yes, but with much more personality than a sports bar.
Okay.
Sports bars are the death of mankind, if you ask me.
So are these like a early version of a Quentin Tarantino?
Sort of. They're
Jackie
not.
Brown.
They're not quite that.
Elmore Leonard.
Over the top. There's a lot of Elmore Leonard in here.
Okay.
It's also these books are also considered sort of foreshadowing to Spencer for Hire.
Yeah.
The Robert Parker books. So
Okay.
there's what's interesting about them is they were sold as pulp, sold as pharmacy novels in a sense, but they're not quite as cheesy as the cover art makes them look. They're really well plotted, and they're just fun. It's like watching a 70s cop show.
Well, that's great. I didn't really know there were Atlanta books like
and
this.
that's part of the fun is seeing a whole new side of Atlanta. Your second city. The City of Light.
The City of Light.
City of Light.
Yes, which you could do just as easily as I could with your penchant for F. Scott and
But I love America, so I let you
love
have.
America, right? So one of the books that I had for Paris is a guidebook but it's a fanciful, imaginary guidebook, or a surrealist guidebook. It's by Karen Elizabeth Gordon, who also did a wonderful series of books for grammar called The Transitive Vampire. They're really entertaining, but they also teach you actual grammar rules. And it's illustrated by Nick Bantock, who did the Griffin and Sabine series,
Oh, I
people
love
might
those
remember,
books.
where you would actually pull out the letters and you could open them. It was one of the first books that really took advantage of having the interaction.
Yeah, I used to use those books to court in my single days.
That would have been a good use of them. Actually, they were quite charming and romantic.
Those were romance bullets. Trust me.
Had to find her.
Yep.
Well, glad to know that worked for you. Just for anybody out there who's single, look them up.
That's right.
But it's called Paris Out of Hand: A Wayward Guide. So it's almost the opposite of what we've just been talking about. Whereas instead of real streets and real hotels and real places, it's the made-up ones, but they're all based on real museums or real places. So and yet it still captures the magic of the city, and it is such a magical city.
Yeah, yeah.
And I've been reading The Thursday Nightman, this is a book. It's by Tonino Binakista. Which, believe it or not, he is French. And one of the things that I found interesting in pulling these books and finding books about cities is how rarely the books are written by authors who are natives of the place. Yeah. The Londoners book that I was so intrigued by was written by a Canadian.
I think people who are native to a place take it for granted in a lot of ways.
Possibly.
And I think the people that move there or go there are the ones that really fall in love with it or discover it.
And who see the things that are distinctive about it.
It's not an everyday sort of vision for people who go there, whether they go for a short time or whether they stay. So what's the plot of that book?
Well, it's sort of a natural segue from yours. Wronged, jilted, or otherwise left alone men gather on Thursday nights to tell their stories. And they're all Parisians, or at least are in the city for some time. So it's a bit of a play on the city of love, the idea of the romance of Paris, and the journeys that these men have experienced in their lovelorn lives.
So is it a plotted novel, or is it kind of vignettes or episodes, or
more plotted?
More plotted. Okay.
But it's quite different from reading an American book. It is in translation.
Yeah.
So originally written in French, and it's interesting. It's not as concrete. It's not as plotted as what we typically are accustomed to.
Okay.
If you want that and want to read about Paris, then we go back to an American writer, and she's very popular. Cara Black has an entire mystery series set in Paris. Her detective is a woman who's a computer programmer and manages to keep getting wrapped up in murder mysteries on a fairly regular basis.
I think what's fun about doing a series in a city like that is the way that the books focus on different parts of the city. It's books like that are usually not repetitive.
She picks a different neighborhood, arrondissement. Like this one is in the oldest Chinatown in Paris, of which there are multiple Chinatowns. I didn't know that.
Right.
And it takes place in a restaurant in Chinatown, or at least it starts there. And she has one set in the Bastille. So she picks different places around Paris. So it's a bit of a geography lesson about the city when you read the series.
Yeah.
And they're quite accessible. They're fast-paced, very typical American murder mysteries that happen to be set in Paris among Parisians.
There's nothing better than a murder mystery where you can hear the footsteps on the cobblestones. I mean, that's what I
And one of the distinctions about this one is that Amy is always getting her high heels caught in the cobblestones. And that's one of the funny things, too, about the different books. The books in Paris are very much about the architecture. They reference art a lot, and fashion a good bit, and occasionally food. The books set in Venice, there's food everywhere. We're constantly referring to food. Not so much in the London books. which is
There's-
not really
there's
surprising.
a reason for that.
Yeah, not a lot of food, a lot about traffic.
Coming back to America, when we did our settings book, I did Key West, and I did a guy that I love to death, Thomas Sanchez. He just had a new novel come out in January where he returned to Key West, and I love this book. I mean, I think I read it in 2 days. It's interesting because very divisive book. I think it's really over the top. The way I describe it is sort of Adderall on the page. It's really visceral and kinetic. But what's cool about it is, one of the things that's great about, one of the things that's tragic but compelling about Key West is it has become such a tourist city that the tourist population has really overwhelmed the locals to the point where, the folks who were original residents, who would be the service industry essentially, are having a hard time affording the place and can't live there. But it's also being sold as an eco-thriller. So it's a lot about the fishing industry there.
That's really growing, particularly in Florida.
Yeah. Takes you to Mallory Square, of course, where you see the big the big love boats pull up and all the, people get out there.
The hordes.
Right, but
really,
it does take you
like
into
locusts.
the sort of old residential districts and really lets you see what the houses are like. And the main character here is a female police officer, and so it's a lot of fun to follow her around, in a sense, the city. There's a great chase scene in the Key West Aquarium that is a load of fun. I also recently found this book, which is a historical novel about Key West in the 1930s, of course, when Hemingway lived there. And what's interesting about this period is Key West was broke during the Depression, and so the Roosevelt's government came in and they essentially took over Key West and rehabilitated it.
Is this the WPA?
Well, it was WPA they were down there. They actually formed what was called a Key West Authority, which was its own government. And there was one guy who's sort of an entrepreneur figure who's still very controversial down there, who came in and started running everything. But this is a great book because if you read these two books side by side, you see how things were consciously changed in the 30s in order to appeal to tourists, and then you come to the modern version and you see sort of the consequences of that. So
that's fascinating.
It's a neat juxtaposition. All right, Venice.
So Venice, two books, sort of from one end of the spectrum to the other. To try to get everybody in here. This is a young adult novel. It's called The Thief Lord. Two orphan boys, run away to Venice and sort of find their future there. And it's all about the magic of the city. And one of them makes the interesting observation that had never occurred to me before, but since there are no cars, there are no horns honking.
Oh.
I thought, well, that's the complete opposite of the other cities, Paris and London and certainly New York. So to think of a major city that's very populated but without cars.
Right.
And there's food, both in this one and in the other book, another mystery series. It's by Donna Leon, another American. And her detective always goes home for lunch with the family, which just seems like such a lovely thing to do. And they cook every day.
It strikes me that one of the big challenges of doing books setting famous cities like Venice would be, I'm thinking right off the head, there's got to be a gondola scene. There's, in Paris, there's got to be the cafes, and, I think
they do, but it's more a part of the normal.
Right.
It's not something that is a focal point of the plot, like it maybe would be for, like in an American action movie.
Right. Well, I'm thinking, in order to do it and do it in a fresh way, you've really got to reinvent those things and make them not such a sort of Epcot Center cliche, if you want to think of it that way.
Right.
And that's I think that would be the challenge of. I couldn't imagine going to Paris and writing a Paris novel. I mean, it would be overwhelming.
Unless you were doing it as an American.
Yeah.
I find it really interesting that they put themselves in the place of a Venetian and how, or a Parisian, and how some of them will choose to throw in the foreign word every now and then. Like they start the sentence with the foreign word and then finish it in English. or they just go straight out English, or do they change the syntax a little bit to be what we would hear someone who speaks Italian speaking in English? And they each approach it in a different way.
There's nothing worse than reading a book where somebody is trying to do a bad accent, you know.
Yeah, it's distracting.
Yeah, so usually they put it in pretty straightforward English. Okay, one more city, one more domestic one close to our hearts.
One close to our hearts.
We had to do Montgomery books, of course, and probably I would say the most famous. I don't know that there's any Montgomery novel that's really famous, but probably the best known one is by Rita Mae Brown, called Southern Discomfort. Now look at, I mean, this cover here.
Yeah,
just
you
kills
definitely
me.
were picking some cover winners.
This, you know, I hate to say this looks like something Bob Guccione took in 1983, but it's a much better book than the cover was. But what I love about this book is it is set in Montgomery. It's set in downtown Montgomery. It's a bit of a parody. Let me just read you a quick passage here, because this cracked me up. It starts down on Water Street, which for those of you who aren't aware, that was
technical difficulties.
Technical difficulties. Sorry, have to
You've
pull
never
out
gone
my
for your glasses
have
in
to
a
pull
show
out
before.
my old man glasses
Do you
here.
want me to read it?
That's all right.
I can see.
Because I have to do some
I'm
editing.
younger
here.
than you are.
Each resident views a city with a particular set of references. Blue Rhonda and Banana May, gives you a flavor of the characters there, looked at Montgomery, Alabama in terms of sex. The town resembled a stud farm. That's how you know right there it's fiction. Although everybody lied through their teeth about a word we can't say on television. Maybe the real difference between Blue Rhonda, Banana May, and the rest of Montgomery's citizens was that they told the truth. They are prostitutes. They are the city's prostitutes.
I didn't know Montgomery had any.
Well, they all worked down on Water Street down there by the railroad station. So in this world, lying, something else we can't say on TV, and thieving are prerogatives of the sane. Small wonder that the two women, or any prostitutes for that matter, were regarded as nuts. It's a
what a bizarre choice that was.
It's a fun book. It is a Southern parody. You know, it's making fun of the South, and it's given sort of old Montgomery a little bit of a tweak there. There, you know, you have a minister, of course, but it's a lot of fun because it does hit a lot of the sites that we're familiar with in Montgomery.
And maybe some that we're not so familiar with in our sheltered upbringing.
Maybe some that you'd like to check out. Unfortunately, they're not there anymore. So, but sorry. Anyway, we are running out of time. It's amazing how quickly when we get going.
And one thing that we wanted to note, if for any of these books, if you're looking for them, or other books that we would suggest about the cities, we have a Pinterest page, Reading for the Rest of Us on Pinterest, where we have each episode, and all of the books that we've discussed in previous episodes are posted there. Right. And we're also on Facebook, Reading for the Rest of Us on Facebook. You can follow our during the week conversations about things that are book related, grassroots reading related.
And we're always interested in getting feedback from viewers about what books they would, if they were doing this show, what they would recommend. So thank you again very much. It's been a wonderful conversation. And as we always like to sign off by saying, please read a good book. Thanks.